Have you ever considered how the whispers of the past echo into our present? How conversations held hundreds of years ago, strange facts unearthed from dusty ledgers, or mysteries that remain unsolved, still subtly shape the world you navigate today. Think about the tea you might drink, the laws that govern your society, or even the borders on a map. So many seemingly disparate things are tangled up in threads spun long ago. For instance, did you know that the British actually tried to use live badgers to sniff out buried treasure in some of their early colonial ventures, or that a certain famous admiral once lost his wig in a particularly blustery naval battle and declared it a more significant loss than half his fleet? These aren't just quaint anecdotes. They're tiny glimpses into the human eccentricities and bold ambitions that defined an entire era. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling chatty, drop a comment below with your location and local time. It's always fascinating to see where everyone is tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself on a small, rainy island in the North Atlantic, centuries before Netflix or even a decent cup of coffee. This isn't the mighty empire you might imagine, but rather a collection of often squabbling kingdoms, perpetually eyeing each other with suspicion. Yet, even then, something unique is stirring. Being an island nation, you intuitively understand the sea. It's not just a barrier, but a highway, a source of sustenance, and a tantalizing invitation to the unknown. Your gaze, almost instinctively, drifts outwards beyond the choppy grey waters. For centuries, you've been a bit of an outlier, a footnote to the grand dramas playing out on the European continent. While Rome built roads and empires, you were largely a frontier. While the Crusaders marched east, you were often preoccupied with your own internal squabbles. But the sea, oh, the sea, it whispers promises of trade, of wealth, of discoveries that could forever change your fortunes. You watch as hardy fishermen brave the waves, as small trading vessels ply the coastal routes, exchanging wool and tin for wine and spices. The concept of empire isn't a grand, premeditated blueprint. It's a slow, organic growth, almost like a particularly persistent weed taking root in fertile soil. You see the seeds of ambition sprouting in the minds of monarchs like Henry VII, who, despite his cautious nature, recognized the importance of a strong navy and sponsored explorers like John Cabot, who, in 1497, touched upon the shores of North America, mistaking it for Asia. This wasn't about conquest yet. It was about finding a quicker route to the fabled riches of the East, spices, silks, and all the exotic luxuries that made European elites swoon. Imagine the sheer audacity, the blind faith of setting sail into an unknown ocean on a wooden boat, hoping to find a shortcut to literally the other side of the world. It's the kind of daring that makes you wonder if they just hadn't invented good painkillers yet, or if the risk of scurvy was genuinely preferable to another dreary English winter. The early forays are tentative, often ill-fated. There are grand pronouncements and very little actual success. Expeditions vanish without a trace. Settlements fail due to disease, starvation, or hostile encounters. You observe the Spanish and Portuguese already dominating the scene, carving up the known world with papal decrees and vast treasure fleets. This, ironically, fuels your desire. You see their gold, their silver, their exotic goods, and a powerful sense of FOMO, fear of missing out. For the uninitiated, starts to grip the English elite. They realize that if they don't get in on this global land grab, they'll be left behind, a minor player in a rapidly expanding world. Historians still argue whether these initial ventures were driven by pure economic greed, religious zeal, or a more complex mix of national pride and the sheer human desire for exploration. But whatever the primary motive, you can feel the shift. The focus moves from merely trading to establishing permanent outposts, places where English law and custom could take root, where resources could be extracted directly, and where a foothold could be gained in the fierce global competition. You begin to understand that this isn't just about finding new trade routes. It's about establishing dominance, about projecting power, and about planting your flag, quite literally, in every corner of the earth you can reach. The stage is set for an epic and often messy adventure. As the 16th century unfolds, you find yourself caught in a growing rivalry that shapes the very destiny of this burgeoning island nation. The clash with Spain. Spain, at this point, is the undisputed heavyweight champion of the seas, its galleons laden with gold and silver plundered from the Americas. You watch with a mix of envy and defiance as their immense wealth flows into Seville, funding grand palaces and an even grander military. But this dominance breeds resentment, and for England, it becomes a crucial catalyst for its own imperial ambitions. You see the English, initially, as a band of ambitious, sometimes reckless, privateers, glorified pirates. If you're being honest, figures like Francis Drake, a man who combined audacious seamanship with a knack for relieving Spanish ships of their valuable cargo, become national heroes. Imagine the sheer audacity. You're sailing a relatively small wooden ship, often outgunned, and you're actively hunting down the mightiest naval power on Earth. It's like a particularly determined squirrel trying to steal nuts from a very large, angry bear. Drake even circumnavigates the globe, a monumental feat of navigation, all while harassing Spanish interests. This isn't just about loot. It's about prestige, about demonstrating that Spain's grip on the oceans isn't as ironclad as it seems. The tension culminates in 1588 with the Spanish Armada. You stand on the cliffs of Plymouth, watching as a vast fleet of Spanish warships, supposedly invincible, bears down on your shores. The mood is tense, fearful, but also defiant. Elizabeth's, the shrewd and charismatic queen, rallies her people with stirring speeches, reminding them that they have the heart and stomach of a king. Historians still argue whether the English Navy's superior tactics or a series of devastating storms played a greater role in the Armada's ultimate defeat. Regardless, the outcome is clear. The Spanish fleet is scattered, battered, and utterly humiliated. This isn't just a naval victory, it's a psychological turning point. It shatters the myth of Spanish invincibility and opens up the Atlantic for English expansion. With the immediate Spanish threat diminished, your gaze turns firmly towards the New World. The allure of North America is immense, not just for gold, which proves elusive, but for land, resources, and a potential haven for dissenting religious groups. You witness the early, often disastrous, attempts to establish permanent settlements. Think Roanoke, the lost colony, where an entire group of settlers simply vanishes, leaving behind only the cryptic word Croatoan carved into a tree. It's a mystery that still gives you shivers, a testament to the harsh realities of pioneering in an untamed wilderness. Then comes Jamestown in 1607, a precarious foothold in Virginia. You watch as the early settlers battle starvation, disease, and tense relations with the indigenous Powhatan people. This isn't some romantic adventure, it's a brutal struggle for survival. Many die, succumbing to unfamiliar illnesses or the sheer difficulty of adapting to a new environment. Yet, they persevere. The discovery that tobacco, a crop already popular in Europe, thrives in the Virginian soil, changes everything. You see the immediate, almost intoxicating appeal of this cash crop. It's addictive, both for the smoker and for the planter, offering the promise of wealth beyond anything available back home. Further north, you observe the Pilgrims landing at Plymouth in 1620, seeking religious freedom. These aren't swashbuckling adventurers. They are devout, determined, and utterly convinced of their divine mission. Their story, often romanticized, is one of immense hardship, survival against overwhelming odds, and the beginning of a distinct American identity. While the motivations here are primarily religious, the underlying drive for new land, new resources, and a fresh start aligns perfectly with the broader imperial project. So, as you watch these early English colonists hack their way through dense forests and face down unfamiliar challenges, you begin to grasp the evolving nature of the empire. It's no longer just about raiding Spanish treasure ships. It's about planting roots, about cultivating resources, and about establishing permanent settlements that will, in time, become self-sustaining and, crucially, profitable. The initial struggles are immense, but the lessons learned are invaluable, paving the way for the truly massive expansion that is yet to come. The first dominoes have fallen, setting in motion a chain reaction that will ripple across the globe. You now shift your gaze across the vast Atlantic, away from the nascent settlements of North America and towards the sun-drenched, fertile islands of the Caribbean. This is where the empire truly begins to taste the intoxicating sweetness of immense, brutal profit. While North America offers space and opportunity, the Caribbean offers something far more immediate and lucrative. Sugar. Imagine the heat, the humidity, the vibrant, almost overwhelming green of the landscape. You see the early English settlements on islands like Barbados and Jamaica, initially struggling, much like Jamestown, with disease and the harsh realities of a new climate. But then, the discovery, sugarcane thrives here. It grows with incredible vigor, yielding a product that is rapidly becoming a highly sought-after luxury in Europe. Sugar isn't just a sweetener. It's a status symbol, a source of energy, and, critically, a highly addictive commodity. It's the crude oil of the 17th century, transforming barren islands into gold mines. But there's a problem, a huge, insurmountable problem. For the English planters, growing sugarcane is incredibly labor-intensive. It requires constant tending, harvesting, and processing in crushing mills. The indigenous populations have been decimated by European diseases and brutal treatment. Indentured servants from Europe, often poor and desperate, are lured with promises of land and fortune. But many perish from disease or simply cannot withstand the back-breaking labor in the tropical heat. You see the planters' desperation, their relentless drive for more and more labor to meet the insatiable demand for sugar back home. This is where you witness the true horror of the transatlantic slave trade becoming the bedrock of the empire's Caribbean wealth. You observe the ships, increasingly large and numerous, making the infamous Middle Passage from West Africa. Imagine being packed into the hold of one of these vessels, hundreds of souls crammed into unimaginable conditions, suffering disease, starvation, and despair, often for weeks on end. It's a journey that defies human comprehension, a testament to the depths of human cruelty, fueled by the promise of profit. You see the sheer dehumanization that allows one group of people to treat another as mere cargo, as property destined for a life of forced labor. When the enslaved Africans arrive in the Caribbean, they are subjected to horrific conditions. You see them toiling under the relentless sun, clearing land, planting cane, and working the mills. The life expectancy on these plantations is shockingly short, often just a few years, due to brutal treatment, inadequate food, and rampant disease. The planters devise elaborate systems of control, from physical violence to psychological terror, to maintain their absolute power. It's a chillingly efficient, yet utterly barbaric, system designed to extract maximum labor and profit. Historians still argue whether the scale of the transatlantic slave trade was an inevitable consequence of the sugar economy, or if it could have been avoided with different choices. But what is undeniable is that the wealth generated from these sugar plantations, built on the backs of enslaved people, poured back into Britain, fueling its burgeoning industries, enriching its merchants, and providing capital for further imperial expansion. You see grand country estates built in England, funded by the sweat and blood of enslaved Africans in distant colonies. You observe port cities like Bristol and Liverpool transforming into bustling hubs, their prosperity inextricably linked to the triangular trade, manufactured goods from Britain to Africa, enslaved people from Africa to the Caribbean, and sugarum tobacco from the Caribbean back to Britain. It's a vicious, self-perpetuating cycle of exploitation. The Caribbean, therefore, isn't just a collection of tropical islands. It becomes the brutal, beating heart of early British imperial capitalism. It's a place where the empire perfected its methods of resource extraction and labor control, methods that would later be adapted and applied in other parts of its vast dominion. The legacy of this period, the immense wealth alongside the unimaginable suffering, casts a long and complex shadow, a stain on the otherwise grand narrative of imperial achievement. It's a sobering reminder that every sweet success often has a bitter, hidden cost. While the Caribbean plantations churned out sugar and immense wealth, your attention now turns eastward, thousands of miles away, to a land of unimaginable riches and ancient civilizations. India. This isn't a story of outright conquest at first, but rather of cunning, commerce, and the slow, insidious creep of corporate power. You are about to witness the rise of a truly unique entity in the history of empire. The East India Company. Imagine a trading company, not a government, that eventually commands armies, levies taxes, and rules vast swathes of a continent. It sounds like something out of a futuristic dystopia, but this was the reality of the East India Company. Chartered by Queen Elizabeth I in 1600, its initial purpose was simple: to break into the lucrative spice trade dominated by the Dutch and Portuguese. You envision small, sturdy ships, battling fierce storms and even fiercer rivals, determined to bring back cloves, pepper, and cinnamon to insatiable European markets. Initially, the company's presence in India is modest. You see them establishing small trading posts or factories along the coast: Surat, Madras, now Chennai, Bombay, now Mumbai, and Calcutta, now Kolkata. These aren't colonies in the traditional sense. They are fortified warehouses and administrative centers, places to store goods, conduct business, and protect their interests. The company operates at the pleasure of powerful Indian rulers, like the Mughal emperors, who view these European traders as minor players, perhaps a bit troublesome, but ultimately useful for their exotic goods and revenue. It's like a particularly persistent door-to-door salesman who, over time, starts buying up the entire street. The key to the company's success lies in its understanding of trade and its ruthless pursuit of profit. You observe them dealing in textiles, the exquisite cottons and silks of India, which are in huge demand in Europe, as well as spices, saltpeter for gunpowder, and later, opium. They learn to navigate the complex political landscape of India, often playing one regional ruler against another, offering military support in exchange for trading concessions or territorial rights. This is where the line between commerce and conquest begins to blur. A pivotal moment you witness is the decline of the mighty Mughal Empire. As its central authority weakens, a power vacuum emerges, and various regional states and warlords begin to vie for control. The East India Company, with its growing military capabilities, a private army composed of European officers and Indian sepoys, is perfectly positioned to exploit this fragmentation. You see how the company, initially a guest, gradually transforms into a power broker, then a protector, and finally, a ruler. It's a classic example of the frog slowly boiling in the pot. The change is so gradual that by the time you realize what's happening, it's too late. One defining battle you observe is the Battle of Plassey in 1757. Here, Robert Clive, a flamboyant and controversial figure, leads a company force, significantly outnumbered, against the Nawab of Bengal through a combination of daring, deception, and the defection of key Indian commanders. Clive secures a decisive victory. This isn't just a military win. It's a political earthquake. It grants the company enormous revenue rights in Bengal, one of India's richest provinces. You watch as vast sums of money, collected as taxes, begin to flow into the company's coffers, transforming it from a mere trading entity into a powerful territorial ruler. It's essentially a corporate takeover of an entire region. Historians still debate the extent to which the British deliberately engineered the downfall of the Mughal Empire versus simply capitalizing on its existing weaknesses. But what is clear is that Plassey marks a significant shift. From this point forward, the East India Company ceases to be just a commercial enterprise and becomes a formidable political and military power in India. Its insatiable appetite for profit and control drives further expansion, pulling it deeper and deeper into the subcontinent's intricate web of alliances and conflicts. You realize that the foundations for the jewel in the crown are being laid piece by agonizing piece, often through calculated aggression disguised as beneficial trade. The stage is being set for an imperial drama of epic proportions. As the East India Company consolidates its power in India, your focus must now widen to encompass the global stage. For centuries, Europe has been a hotbed of rivalry, and by the 18th century, these tensions are spilling over into every corner of the world where European powers have a presence. You are about to witness the era of global conflicts, where the pursuit of empire becomes inextricably linked to the grand dynastic struggles and economic competition back on the continent. Imagine a chess game played not just on a board, but across oceans and continents, with entire nations as the pieces. The main antagonists in this grand strategic struggle are Britain and France. For over 100 years, these two nations are locked in a relentless contest for supremacy, a veritable second 100 years war. You see their ambitions colliding in North America, in the Caribbean, in Africa, and most significantly, in India. It's like watching two siblings constantly bickering over toys. Only the toys are entire continents, and the bickering involves massive armies and navies. In North America, you observe the ongoing struggle for control of vast territories. The British colonies, clustered along the Atlantic seaboard, push westward, encountering French fur traders and fortifications in the Ohio Valley and Canada. This culminates in the 7 Years' War, known in America as the French and Indian War, a truly global conflict that rages from 1756 to 1763. You witness pitched battles in the snowy forests of Quebec, naval engagements in the Atlantic, and skirmishes deep in the American wilderness. The sheer scale of it is staggering. This isn't just local squabbles, but a coordinated effort to dismantle rival imperial systems. The outcome of the 7 Years' War is monumental for Britain. You see the Treaty of Paris in 1763, where France cedes most of its North American possessions to Britain including Canada. Imagine the vastness of that territorial acquisition. Britain now stands as the dominant power in North America. This victory, however, comes at a significant cost, leaving Britain with a colossal debt that will have profound and unintended consequences in the colonies. It's like winning the lottery, only to realize the prize money is in pennies, and you have to count every single one of them. Simultaneously, the conflict rages in the Caribbean. You watch as islands change hands multiple times, their sugar wealth making them invaluable strategic prizes. While some islands are returned to their former owners after the war, Britain solidifies its hold on key sugar-producing territories, further cementing the economic engine of its empire. But perhaps the most decisive arena for this Anglo-French rivalry is India. You observed in the previous section how the East India Company was consolidating its power. Now, you see the French, through their own East India Company, attempting to do the same. This leads to a series of proxy wars and direct confrontations between British and French forces on Indian soil. Figures like Joseph-François Dupleix for the French and Robert Clive for the British become fierce rivals, employing similar tactics of playing local rulers against each other and building up their own private armies. You witness the Carnatic Wars in India, a series of conflicts that are essentially a miniature European war fought on Asian soil. The British ultimately prevail, largely due to their superior naval power, which allows them to resupply their forces and isolate French outposts. By the end of the 7 Years' War, French influence in India is largely curtailed, leaving the British East India Company as the undisputed European power in the subcontinent. Historians still argue whether the 7 Years' War was truly the First World War due to its global reach and interconnectedness, but its impact on the British Empire is undeniable. You see Britain emerging from this period as the preeminent global power, its navy unchallenged, its colonial possessions vastly expanded, and its commercial interests flourishing. The conflicts have been brutal and costly, but they have forged a stronger, more assertive empire. However, the very success of this expansion sows the seeds for future challenges, particularly in its increasingly restive American colonies, who are beginning to chafe under the heavy hand of imperial rule and the financial burdens of a distant war. The empire has proven its might, but it has also tightened the strings on its increasingly independent-minded subjects. The vast territorial gains from the 7 Years' War, while seemingly a triumph, quickly lead to a profound and unexpected crisis: the loss of the 13 American colonies. You now experience the slow, agonizing unraveling of what was, at that point, the most prized jewel in the British colonial crown. This isn't a sudden explosion, but a growing crescendo of resentment, misunderstanding, and ultimately, outright rebellion. Imagine the perspective of the American colonists. They fought alongside British soldiers against the French, enduring hardship and sacrificing lives. They view themselves as loyal subjects, but also as distinct entities, far removed from the strictures of Westminster. You see them chafing under new taxes and regulations imposed by a parliament thousands of miles away, a parliament in which they have no direct representation. The cry of no taxation without representation isn't just a catchy slogan. It's the articulation of a deep-seated grievance. It's like being forced to pay for your neighbor's leaky roof when you don't even live on the same street. You witness a series of escalating provocations. The Stamp Act, requiring expensive stamps on all legal documents and printed materials, sparks widespread outrage and boycotts. The Townshend Acts impose duties on goods like tea, glass, and paper, leading to further protests and a hardening of colonial resolve. You see instances of civil disobedience, acts of defiance, that begin as isolated incidents and grow into a widespread movement. The Boston Massacre, where British soldiers fire on an angry crowd, further inflames public opinion, creating martyrs for the colonial cause. Then comes the Boston Tea Party in 1773. You watch as colonists, disguised as Native Americans, board British tea ships and dump valuable cargo into Boston Harbor. This isn't just a protest against a tax, it's a direct challenge to British authority, a defiant act of vandalism. The British response, the Intolerable Acts, is punitive and heavy-handed, closing Boston Harbor and stripping Massachusetts of its self-governance. This response, rather than quelling the rebellion, serves only to unite the disparate colonies against a common enemy. You observe the formation of the Continental Congress, a gathering of colonial representatives initially seeking reconciliation but increasingly moving towards independence. The rhetoric shifts from appeals for rights as Englishmen to a bold assertion of universal human rights. The writings of figures like Thomas Paine, whose pamphlet Common Sense lays out a compelling argument for republicanism, ignite the flames of revolution in countless hearts. The first shots are fired at Lexington and Concord in 1775, marking the beginning of armed conflict. You see colonial militias, initially disorganized but fiercely determined, engaging British regular troops. The war for independence is not a foregone conclusion. The British possess a formidable military, a powerful navy, and superior resources. They have loyalist support within the colonies. However, you also see the immense challenges they face. Fighting a war thousands of miles from home, operating in unfamiliar terrain, and facing an enemy highly motivated by the defense of their homes and ideals. It's like trying to win a game of whack-a-mole when all the moles are hiding in a vast forest. George Washington emerges as the unlikely leader of the Continental Army, a man whose perseverance and strategic brilliance, despite numerous setbacks, keep the colonial cause alive. You witness pivotal moments like the crossing of the Delaware and the victory at Saratoga, which proves crucial in convincing France to openly support the American cause. This French intervention, a result of their long-standing rivalry with Britain, provides vital military and financial aid, turning a colonial rebellion into an international conflict. Finally, in 1781, you see the decisive Battle of Yorktown, where a combined American and French force traps a British army. The surrender of General Cornwallis marks the effective end of the war. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris formally recognizes the independence of the United States of America, Historians still argue whether the American Revolution was primarily about abstract ideals of liberty or more about economic grievances and the desire for self-governance free from distant interference. Regardless, its impact on the British Empire is profound. You observe a major psychological blow, a loss of prestige, and a re-evaluation of imperial strategy. The empire has lost its most populous and arguably most valuable colonial possession. This forces Britain to pivot, to look for new territories, and to refine its approach to colonial governance, inadvertently setting the stage for even greater expansion in other parts of the world. The lesson learned, painfully, is that distant control can breed fierce resistance. With the bitter taste of American defeat still fresh, you observe a profound moral and economic shift beginning to ripple through the British Empire. The age of abolition. This isn't a sudden epiphany, but a gradual, often contentious movement that challenges the very foundation of the empire's immense wealth. The transatlantic slave trade and the institution of slavery itself. Imagine the deeply ingrained economic realities. You've seen how the sugar plantations of the Caribbean, powered by enslaved labor, generated colossal fortunes. The slave trade itself was a massive industry enriching merchants, ship owners, and financiers across Britain. To challenge slavery was to challenge a powerful economic lobby, a system that had been normalized for centuries. It's like asking a multi-billion-dollar corporation to voluntarily dismantle its most profitable division for purely ethical reasons. Yet, a growing chorus of voices begins to question this horrific practice. You witness the emergence of powerful abolitionist movements in Britain, driven by a diverse coalition of Quakers and evangelical Christians who appealed to moral and religious principles, arguing that slavery was a sin against God and humanity. You also see former enslaved people, like Olaudah Equiano, publishing powerful narratives of their experiences, providing first-hand accounts of the brutality and dehumanization of the system, which resonate deeply with a growing segment of the British public. Their stories are a visceral, undeniable counterpoint to the abstract economic arguments. The efforts are organized and relentless. You see individuals like William Wilberforce, a dedicated member of Parliament, tirelessly campaigning for decades, introducing bills, delivering impassioned speeches, and building a broad-based political movement. It's a slow, arduous process, akin to pushing a massive boulder uphill against gravity and popular opinion. Petitions flood Parliament, public meetings are held, and the public conscience is slowly but surely awakened. Beyond the moral arguments, you also perceive evolving economic considerations. Some historians still argue whether the decline of the slave trade was more a result of genuine moral awakening, or if it was increasingly seen as economically inefficient or outdated, particularly as Britain's industrial economy began to diversify. Regardless, the combined pressure of moral outrage and shifting economic thought proved potent. The first major victory comes in 1807, with the abolition of the Slave Trade Act. You observe Parliament, after years of fierce debate, finally outlawing the trading of enslaved people by British subjects. This means British ships are no longer legally permitted to transport enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. Imagine the mixed emotions, relief and joy for the abolitionists, but despair and defiance from those who profit from the trade. This act is a monumental step, but it's crucial to understand that it doesn't abolish slavery itself. It only stops the importation of new enslaved people. Existing enslaved populations remain in bondage. It's like cutting off the supply of building materials while still expecting the construction to continue. The Royal Navy, once a key instrument of imperial expansion, is now tasked with patrolling the West African coast to suppress the illegal slave trade, intercepting slave ships, and freeing their human cargo. You see the dangerous and often thankless work of these naval patrols, a strange reversal of roles for a navy that had previously facilitated the very trade it was now combating. However, the struggle isn't over. The plantations in the Caribbean still rely on forced labor, and the profits continue to flow. It takes another quarter century of relentless campaigning before the ultimate goal is achieved. In 1833, the Slavery Abolition Act is finally passed. You witness the dramatic moment when Parliament votes to abolish slavery throughout the British Empire. This is a truly landmark moment, ending a practice that had defined much of the empire's early wealth. But even this momentous act comes with a bitter irony. The enslavers, the slave owners, are compensated for their loss of property to the tune of $20 million, an enormous sum at the time, equivalent to roughly 40% of the government's annual expenditure. Imagine that the victims receive nothing, while those who profited from human misery are handsomely rewarded. This compensation debt is so vast that it isn't fully paid off by British taxpayers until 2015. It's a stark reminder of the enduring legacy of this dark chapter and how financial interests often overshadowed pure justice. The Age of Abolition marks a significant, albeit imperfect, moral turning point for the empire. It demonstrates the capacity for a powerful, centralized state to respond to public pressure and enact profound social change. It also highlights the growing awareness of human rights, however selectively applied, within the British consciousness. This shift, born from moral crusades and complex economic calculations, will influence how the empire justifies and expands its reach in the centuries to come. As the moral compass of the empire recalibrates with the abolition of slavery, you witness a new, far more powerful force emerging, one that will fundamentally reshape Britain's global dominance: the Industrial Revolution. This isn't just a technological shift, it's a societal earthquake, transforming Britain into the workshop of the world and providing the empire with an unprecedented advantage. Imagine a world where everything is suddenly faster, stronger, and produced on a scale previously unimaginable. You see the invention of the steam engine, initially for pumping water out of mines, then adapted for factories and, crucially, for transportation. Coal becomes the new black gold, fueling the insatiable appetite of these new machines. Iron, and later steel, become the backbone of this new industrial landscape, shaping everything from bridges to new machinery It's like discovering a cheat code for reality, suddenly granting you immense power. You observe the rapid growth of factories, particularly textile mills, where cotton, much of it sourced from the newly expanded British India and the American South, is spun and woven into cloth with incredible efficiency, no longer a goods produced slowly by hand in homes. Now, vast quantities pour out of colossal brick buildings, driven by the rhythmic thrum of machinery. This mass production creates an enormous demand for raw materials: cotton, wool, timber, minerals, which the empire, with its global reach, is perfectly positioned to supply. This industrial might provides Britain with several key advantages for its imperial project. Firstly, economic power. British manufactured goods are cheaper, higher quality, and produced in greater volume than anywhere else in the world. You see these goods flooding global markets, often outcompeting local industries and creating new dependencies. Britain becomes the world's primary exporter, its balance of trade heavily skewed in its favor. This creates wealth that can be reinvested in infrastructure, military, and further imperial expansion. It's like having a perpetual money-making machine in your backyard. Secondly, technological superiority. The same innovations that drive industrial production also revolutionize military capabilities. You see the development of more efficient firearms, advanced artillery, and, critically, steam-powered warships. Imagine the sheer psychological impact of a steam-powered ironclad sailing into a harbor, seemingly impervious to traditional defenses, against a foe still relying on sail and cannon. This technological gap allows Britain to project power more effectively and subdue resistance with devastating efficiency, often with minimal casualties on their side. Thirdly, logistical advantage. The invention of the steamship radically transforms global travel. No longer are ships dependent on the vagaries of wind. They can travel faster, more predictably, and against currents, connecting the distant parts of the empire with unprecedented speed. You see these iron vessels belching smoke, ferrying troops, goods, and administrators across oceans in a fraction of the time it once took. And on land, the railway begins to crisscross Britain, and later, the colonies, enabling the rapid movement of raw materials to ports and finished goods to markets. It shrinks the world, bringing distant lands closer to the imperial center. Historians still argue whether the Industrial Revolution was primarily a cause or a consequence of empire, or a complex interplay between the two, but it's undeniable that the two phenomena became mutually reinforcing. The empire provided the raw materials and captive markets necessary for industrial growth, while industrialization provided the tools and wealth necessary for imperial expansion and maintenance. You also observe the burgeoning growth of British cities, Manchester, Birmingham, Glasgow, becoming centers of industry, often at a terrible human cost. The working conditions are harsh, the urban environments are polluted, and social inequalities are stark. Yet, the overall effect is an enormous surge in national wealth and power, a self-perpetuating engine of economic and military might. By the mid-19th century, Britain stands alone as the world's only truly industrialized nation. This technological and economic supremacy gives it an overwhelming advantage in the coming scramble for Africa and solidifies its position as the dominant global power. The era of informal empire, where trade and influence were paramount, begins to transition into one of more direct control, driven by the insatiable demands of the industrial machine. The empire is no longer just expanding, it is accelerating, powered by the roar of steam and the clatter of looms, with its industrial engines roaring and its naval power unchallenged. You now enter an era often referred to as Pax Britannica, or British peace. This isn't peace in the universal sense, but rather a period roughly 1815–1914, where British naval and economic supremacy creates a global environment largely free from major European wars, allowing Britain to consolidate and expand its empire virtually unhindered. Imagine Britain as the world's policeman, or perhaps more accurately, the world's most dominant business owner, setting the terms of trade and ensuring stability where it benefits its interests. You see the Royal Navy, now steam-powered and increasingly formidable, patrolling every major ocean. Its presence deters rivals, protects trade routes, and projects an image of overwhelming power. If a faraway port decided it didn't quite fancy British goods, or a local ruler got a bit too feisty, a British gunboat would often appear on the horizon, politely or not so politely, suggesting a change of mind. It's an era where gunboat diplomacy is a highly effective, if somewhat blunt, instrument of foreign policy. This period sees the rapid expansion of the global trade network. With Britain at its center, you observe British manufactured goods flowing outwards to every corner of the globe, while raw materials, cotton, timber, minerals, foodstuffs, flow back to feed the insatiable demand of British factories. The financial capital accumulated in London makes it the world's undisputed financial hub. You see investments pouring into railways, mines, and plantations across the empire, further binding these territories to the imperial core. It's like a giant, meticulously designed plumbing system, with all the pipes leading to and from Britain. During Pax Britannica, the empire's reach extends significantly. You witness the acquisition and consolidation of territories through various means, sometimes through direct conquest, as in parts of India, sometimes through treaties, and often through the establishment of protectorates and spheres of influence, where local rulers ostensibly remained in power, but were, in reality, heavily influenced or controlled by British agents and policies. One major development you see is the formalization of control over India. After the Indian Rebellion of 1857, which the British often referred to as the Sepoy Mutiny, direct rule is imposed. The East India Company, whose methods had become increasingly controversial, is disbanded, and India officially becomes part of the British Crown. Imagine the spectacle of Queen Victoria being declared Empress of India in 1876, a symbolic act that cements India's status as the jewel in the crown and demonstrates the sheer scale of British ambition and territorial acquisition. You might think of it as upgrading from a very large, powerful corporation to a full-blown national takeover. You also see expansion into Australia and New Zealand, initially as penal colonies, but rapidly transforming into settler colonies with vast agricultural potential, particularly for wool. These territories, with their temperate climates and significant resources, become integral parts of the empire, attracting waves of British migrants seeking new opportunities. In Africa, while the full scramble is yet to come, Britain establishes coastal outposts and begins to exert influence, particularly around the Cape Colony in South Africa, strategically important for controlling sea routes. You also observe the continued, if sometimes subtle, expansion into parts of Southeast Asia, securing vital ports and resources. Historians still argue whether Pax Britannica was truly a period of peace, given the numerous colonial wars and interventions that occurred globally, or if it simply meant the absence of large-scale European conflict. However, it's undeniable that during this period, Britain was able to project its power with unparalleled effectiveness, shaping global commerce, law, and even culture. The empire seemed unstoppable, its influence radiating outwards, touching almost every corner of the earth. It was a time of immense confidence and self-belief for Britain, laying the groundwork for the most intense phase of imperial expansion yet to come as other European powers finally caught up with their industrial ambitions. The late 19th century brings you to a feverish, almost desperate phase of imperial expansion, the scramble for Africa. You witness European powers, spurred by industrial might and nationalistic fervor, carving up an entire continent with astonishing speed and ruthlessness. Imagine a dozen hungry guests descending on a banquet table, each determined to grab as much as they can, with little regard for the existing inhabitants. For centuries, much of Africa had remained largely unexplored by Europeans, beyond coastal trading posts. Now, suddenly, the continent becomes the ultimate prize. You see a potent combination of factors driving this frenzy. Firstly, economic motives. Africa is rich in raw materials crucial for industrialized Europe. Rubber, diamonds, gold, timber, and various minerals. It also offers potential new markets for manufactured goods, though this often proves less significant than the raw materials. Secondly, strategic interests. Controlling key waterways and territories offers tactical advantages in the global power game. Thirdly, national prestige. Acquiring colonies becomes a potent symbol of national power and greatness, a source of intense competition between European states. Lastly, and most cynically, the idea of a civilizing mission, the supposed duty to bring Christianity and Western civilization to backward peoples, provides a moral veneer for blatant exploitation. You observe the pace accelerating in the 1880s. Explorers, missionaries, and adventurers like Henry Morton Stanley, famous for finding David Livingstone map out the interior, revealing its vast resources and diverse populations. These reports, often exaggerated, fuel the appetite of European governments and colonial companies. The Berlin Conference of 1884-1885 is a chilling testament to this era. You witness representatives from 14 European nations, with no African representation whatsoever, sitting around a table in Germany and literally dividing the continent amongst themselves. They establish rules for claiming territory, essentially legalizing the land grab. Imagine a group of powerful strangers deciding the fate of your entire neighborhood, drawing lines on a map without ever setting foot on your property or asking your opinion. It's a surreal display of imperial arrogance. Britain, already a dominant global power, enters the scramble with a clear advantage. You see it pursuing a strategy of securing vast swathes of territory, often with the ambitious goal of a Cape to Cairo railway connecting British possessions from the very south to the very north of the continent. Figures like Cecil Rhodes, a diamond magnate and politician, embody this aggressive expansionism. You watch as he dreams of painting the map red, the color traditionally used to denote British territories across Africa, often using brutal force and questionable ethics to achieve his aims. He even once mused, quite openly, about the sheer luck of having been born an Englishman, capable of such grand designs. You observe the acquisition of vast and diverse territories. Egypt, strategically vital for the Suez Canal, built by the French, but under British influence and eventually control, which becomes the gateway to India. Sudan, after a brutal campaign, Uganda and Kenya in East Africa, Nigeria and the Gold Coast, modern-day Ghana in West Africa, and large areas of southern Africa, leading to conflicts with the Dutch-descended Boers. The methods of control vary. Sometimes, existing African kingdoms are outright conquered, their armies no match for European machine guns and artillery. Other times, treaties are signed with local rulers, often under duress or through deception, granting Europeans vast concessions. You see the imposition of direct rule, where British administrators govern directly, or indirect rule, where existing tribal chiefs are co-opted and made subservient to British authority. Historians still argue whether the scramble for Africa was primarily driven by economic necessity, strategic competition, or simply a byproduct of evolving European nationalism and the prestige associated with colonial possessions. Regardless of the primary driver, its impact is devastating and long-lasting. You witness the disruption of traditional societies, the arbitrary drawing of borders that ignored ethnic and cultural realities, a legacy that continues to plague Africa today, the widespread exploitation of resources, and the imposition of foreign systems of governance. The continent, rich in history and diverse cultures, is forcibly brought under European dominion, forever altering its trajectory. The map of Africa, once a patchwork of indigenous kingdoms, is now a kaleidoscope of European colors, with Britain holding the largest and arguably most valuable pieces. Having witnessed the furious partitioning of Africa, you now turn your gaze back to the jewel in the crown, India. This isn't a fresh arrival, but a deeper immersion into the heart of British imperial power, a relationship that is perhaps the most complex, economically significant, and culturally impactful in the entire history of the empire. You are about to understand how India was not just conquered, but profoundly integrated into the British system, often with devastating consequences. Imagine a vast subcontinent, teeming with diverse cultures, languages, religions, and ancient civilizations, now effectively governed by a relatively small number of British officials, soldiers, and merchants. After the Indian Rebellion of 1857, the direct transfer of power from the East India Company to the British Crown marked a new phase. You see the formal establishment of the British Raj from Raj, meaning rule, a system of direct imperial governance. The Governor-General became the Viceroy, representing the monarch, and a complex bureaucratic apparatus was put in place to administer the vast territory. It's like a corporate takeover, evolving into a full-blown hostile government acquisition. Economically, India becomes a crucial component of the Industrial Revolution's success back in Britain. You observe India serving a dual role, a vast source of raw materials and a captive market for British manufactured goods. Indian cotton, jute, tea, and indigo flow to Britain, feeding its factories and industries. In return, British textiles, machinery, and finished goods flood Indian markets, often stifling indigenous industries. You see the immense wealth generated from India, contributing significantly to Britain's prosperity, funding its government, its military, and its social programs. It's a colossal system of extraction, where resources flow predominantly from the colony to the metropole. The construction of infrastructure in India is a defining feature of the Raj. You witness the massive undertaking of building railways, a network of tracks crisscrossing the subcontinent. While the British argue this is for progress and civilization, you recognize its primary purpose: to transport raw materials from the interior to ports for shipment to Britain, and to move troops quickly to suppress any dissent. You also see the development of irrigation systems, canals, and telegraph lines, all designed to facilitate control and economic exploitation. It's an undeniable legacy of infrastructure, but one built squarely within the framework of imperial dominance, like building a very efficient conveyor belt system for someone else's factory. Culturally, the British impact is profound and multifaceted. You observe the imposition of British education systems, promoting English language and Western ideas, often with the aim of creating a class of educated Indians who could serve as intermediaries in the administration. Missionaries arrive, attempting to convert the local population, often clashing with deeply entrenched religious traditions. While some Indians embrace Western education and ideas, many resist, leading to cultural clashes and a growing sense of national identity distinct from British rule. Historians still argue whether the imposition of British legal and administrative systems was ultimately beneficial for India's long-term development, or if it fundamentally disrupted existing, viable indigenous structures. You also see the rigid racial hierarchies that become deeply entrenched. British officials and their families live in segregated communities, maintaining social distance from the Indian population. The belief in British racial and cultural superiority is pervasive, justifying their rule and leading to discrimination and condescension. It's a very polite, tea and cricket-infused system of apartheid, if you will. Despite the economic exploitation and racial inequality, there are also paradoxes. You observe the creation of a unified administrative and legal system across a fragmented subcontinent, something India had not experienced on such a scale before. You see a degree of peace and stability imposed, though often maintained through force. However, this peace comes at the cost of Indian self-determination and the suppression of any genuine political aspirations. The jewel in the crown represents the zenith of British imperial power, a vast and complex enterprise of administration, exploitation, and cultural imposition. India's fate becomes inextricably linked with Britain's, its resources fueling British industrial might, and its people serving both as subjects and, increasingly, as the emerging voice of resistance against foreign rule. The empire in India is not merely a geographic entity, it is a system, meticulously designed and ruthlessly executed, whose legacy continues to shape the subcontinent to this very day. You've seen the sheer scale of the British Empire, how it extended its reach across continents, sometimes with military might, often with commercial cunning. Now, let's delve into a fascinating, often contradictory aspect of this global dominance: the cultural exchange and the inevitable resistance that arose when British traditions met ancient, established societies. Imagine the collision of worlds. British administrators, soldiers, and missionaries arrived in lands with deeply rooted customs, languages, religions, and social structures stretching back millennia. You observe the British often operating from a position of perceived superiority, convinced that their way of life, their laws, their education, their religion was inherently better and should be adopted by the colonized peoples. This often led to earnest, if sometimes misguided, attempts to civilize and improve the native populations. It was a bit like someone showing up to a five-star restaurant and insisting everyone eat lukewarm porridge because that's what they're used to. In India, for instance, you witness the introduction of English education. While intended to create a class of loyal administrators, it inadvertently exposed a generation of Indians to Western liberal ideas of self-determination, nationalism, and individual rights. You see young Indian intellectuals devouring the works of John Locke and John Stuart Mill, internalizing the very concepts of liberty that would later be used to challenge British rule. It's a classic case of teaching someone to fish, only for them to decide they'd rather fish in their own pond. Thank you very much. Conversely, you also see British culture being influenced by the empire. Think of the widespread adoption of tea drinking. Initially a Chinese habit, popularized and supplied by Indian plantations, or consider the introduction of words like pajamas, bungalow, shampoo, and juggernaut into the English language, all originating from India. Even curry, now a staple of British cuisine, began as an Indian dish adapted to British tastes. It's a subtle, almost osmotic exchange where the colonizer, despite their dominance, absorbs elements from the colonized. However, beneath this surface of exchange lay a simmering cauldron of resistance. You observe that opposition to British rule was rarely a monolithic force. It manifested in various forms, from outright armed rebellions to subtle acts of cultural defiance and even intellectual challenges. In the early days, local resistance often came from traditional rulers and their armies, who fought to maintain their sovereignty. You remember the brutal campaigns in India, or the fierce Anglo-Zulu War in southern Africa, where indigenous warriors, despite being outgunned, inflicted significant defeats on British forces, demonstrating immense courage and tactical ingenuity. These were often desperate struggles, ultimately overwhelmed by the superior firepower and organization of the British. As the empire matured, resistance became more organized and ideologically driven. You witness the rise of nationalist movements, particularly in India, but also in parts of Africa and the Caribbean. Educated elites, often those who had absorbed Western political thought, began to articulate demands for greater autonomy and eventually complete independence. Figures like Mahatma Gandhi in India, drawing on both Indian spiritual traditions and Western concepts of non-violent resistance, emerge as powerful symbols of this new form of opposition. His philosophy of satyagraha, or truth force, challenges the very moral legitimacy of British rule, proving incredibly effective at mobilizing mass support. Historians still argue whether the cultural exchange was a genuine two-way street, or if it was predominantly a one-way imposition of British values, but the fact remains that both sides were changed by the encounter. While the British largely viewed their cultural influence as beneficial, many of the colonized saw it as an assault on their identity and traditions, fueling their determination to resist. You also see examples of everyday resistance, quiet defiance in the workplace, the preservation of traditional practices despite official discouragement, or the covert sharing of anti-colonial ideas. These small acts, when multiplied across millions of people, represent a persistent undercurrent of opposition that chips away at the foundations of imperial control. This tension between imposition and resistance, between cultural absorption and defiant preservation, defines much of the colonial experience. It highlights the inherent contradiction of an empire that sought to civilize while simultaneously exploiting, and that preached liberty while denying it to millions. The seeds of decolonization are being sown in these encounters, often cultivated by the very ideas the British themselves introduced. The seemingly invincible edifice of the British Empire, built on centuries of expansion and fortified by industrial might, faces its ultimate crucible in the early 20th century. The World War's toll. You now witness how two cataclysmic global conflicts, fought far from the imperial core, profoundly weaken Britain's grip on its vast territories and accelerate the inevitable process of decolonization. Imagine the sheer scale of the First World War 1914-1918. While often depicted as a European conflict, you observe that it was In fact, a global war fought with imperial resources. Britain, as the dominant colonial power, draws heavily on its empire for manpower, materials, and financial support. You see millions of soldiers from India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and various African and Caribbean colonies fighting on battlefields across Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. Indian troops, for instance, fought with immense bravery in the trenches of the Western Front. In Mesopotamia and in Gallipoli, African laborers toiled in support roles, and colonial resources fueled the British war machine. It's like discovering your sprawling family business, which you thought was just for you, actually depends on the untold efforts of distant cousins you barely knew existed. This participation, however, comes at a tremendous cost. You see the horrific casualties suffered by colonial troops, who often faced discrimination and unequal treatment. Their bravery and sacrifice, however, fundamentally alter the psychological landscape. How can you demand independence from a power you've just helped save from utter defeat? How can you continue to be treated as a second-class citizen when you've shed blood for the mother country? This experience, often traumatic, awakens a deeper sense of national identity and a growing demand for self-determination among the colonized peoples. The economic strain of the war is also immense. You observe Britain, once the world's creditor, becoming a debtor nation, particularly to the United States. Its industries, geared towards wartime production, struggle to compete globally in the post-war period. The cost of maintaining such a vast empire becomes increasingly burdensome, both financially and logistically. Then, just 2 decades later, the world plunges into the even more devastating Second World War 1939-1945. Again, you witness the empire rallying to Britain's side. Colonial troops fight against Nazi Germany in North Africa, against Imperial Japan in Southeast Asia, and contribute vital supplies and resources. The war in Asia, in particular, exposes the vulnerability of British power. You see the swift fall of Singapore, a supposedly impregnable fortress. To the Japanese in 1942, a humiliating blow to British prestige. This event, more than almost any other, shatters the myth of white invincibility in the eyes of millions across Asia. It's like seeing the wizard behind the curtain and realizing he's just an ordinary man. The Second World War pushes Britain to its absolute limits. Its cities are bombed, its economy is crippled, and its resources are exhausted. The concept of an empire built on racial hierarchies becomes increasingly untenable in a war fought against the racist ideology of Nazism. The Atlantic Charter, signed by Churchill and Roosevelt, implicitly champions self-determination, even if Churchill famously claimed he did not become the King's First Minister in order to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire. You hear the rhetoric of freedom and democracy resounding across the globe, and it's a difficult tune to silence when it's also being sung by your subjects. Historians still argue whether the world wars were the definitive cause of the empire's decline or simply accelerated a process already underway due to economic and nationalist pressures. However, their impact is undeniable. The wars inflict enormous human and material costs on Britain, fundamentally altering its global standing. The myth of imperial invincibility is shattered. Financial resources are depleted, and crucially, the psychological contract between ruler and ruled is irrevocably broken. You see a Britain that is physically and economically exhausted, facing a new bipolar world, dominated by the United States and the Soviet Union, both ideologically opposed to traditional colonialism. The wind of change that will soon sweep across the empire is not merely a metaphor. It is the accumulated force of two world wars, empowering the colonized and weakening the colonizer, making the continuation of empire an increasingly unsustainable and unpopular endeavor. The sun, quite literally, is beginning to set on the empire. Having witnessed the devastating impact of the world wars on Britain's imperial strength, you now observe the inevitable and accelerating process of decolonization. This isn't a single event, but a complex series of transitions, sometimes peaceful and negotiated, often violent and traumatic, as former colonies shed the shackles of British rule. The wind of change, a phrase famously coined by Prime Minister Harold Macmillan in 1960, is truly sweeping across the empire. Imagine a dam that has held back a mighty river for centuries. The world wars cracked that dam, and now the pressure of burgeoning nationalist movements, coupled with Britain's depleted resources and a changing global landscape, causes the dam to burst. You see Britain no longer possessing the economic or military might to maintain its vast empire, reluctantly accepting the new reality. The earliest and perhaps most dramatic example is the independence of India in 1947. You recall the immense human and political cost of the jewel in the crown. The end of British rule here isn't a simple handover. Years of sustained non-violent resistance, led by figures like Mahatma Gandhi, coupled with the weariness of a post-war Britain, make continued rule untenable. However, the legacy of imperial policy, particularly the divide and rule strategy, exacerbates religious tensions between Hindus and Muslims. You witness the agonizing decision to partition the subcontinent into two independent nations, India and Pakistan. This decision, intended to prevent civil war, instead triggers one of the largest and most violent mass migrations in human history, resulting in hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of deaths and creating deep, lasting animosities. It's a tragic illustration of how even the act of withdrawal can have devastating unintended consequences. Following India's independence, the dominoes begin to fall rapidly across the rest of Asia. You see Ceylon, Sri Lanka, and Burma, Myanmar gaining independence shortly after. In the Malay Peninsula, British efforts to create a unified Malaya are met with a communist insurgency, a protracted and bloody conflict that finally leads to the formation of Malaysia. In Africa, the pace of decolonization accelerates through the 1950s and 1960s. You witness a range of experiences. In some cases, like Ghana, formerly the Gold Coast, in 1957, led by Kwame Nkrumah, independence is achieved relatively peacefully through constitutional negotiations. Imagine the jubilant scenes of celebrations as the Union Jack is lowered and a new national flag is raised, symbolizing freedom and self-determination. However, other transitions are far from peaceful. In Kenya, you observe the brutal Mau Mau uprising, a protracted guerrilla war against British colonial rule, and white settlers, characterized by immense violence on both sides. The British response is often harsh, involving detention camps and severe repression, leaving a legacy of bitterness. In Cyprus, a similar struggle for independence against British rule unfolds, marked by violence and ethnic tensions. Historians still argue whether Britain's approach to decolonization was a pragmatic and relatively humane withdrawal, or if it was too slow, too self-serving, and often left behind unstable political structures. There's no single answer, as each case had its own unique complexities. You also notice a distinct difference between the experiences of settler colonies and non-settler colonies. Countries like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand had already achieved significant autonomy much earlier and transitioned to full independence relatively smoothly within the framework of the Commonwealth. For them, decolonization was more about formalizing an existing reality. For the vast majority of colonies, however, it was a struggle against foreign domination. By the mid-1960s, the vast majority of Britain's former colonies have achieved independence. The empire, which once covered a quarter of the globe, is rapidly shrinking. You see the British public, battered by 2 wars and facing domestic challenges, increasingly weary of the financial and moral burdens of empire. The era of direct imperial rule is drawing to a close, leaving behind a complex legacy that continues to shape the geopolitical landscape and the internal dynamics of countless nations. The sun has not just set, it has all but vanished from the imperial horizon. You've just witnessed the rapid pace of decolonization, particularly the monumental, yet painful, independence of India. Now, let's delve deeper into that single, most significant moment of imperial unraveling, the partition of India in 1947. This event is a stark illustration of how the hasty retreat of an imperial power can leave behind a deeply scarred landscape, marked by violence and enduring animosity. Imagine the subcontinent in the aftermath of World War II. Britain is exhausted, financially crippled, and facing immense pressure to grant India independence. You see a complex political landscape, the Indian National Congress, advocating for a unified, secular India, and the Muslim League, led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, demanding a separate homeland for Muslims, fearing marginalization in a Hindu-majority India. This isn't a new division. British divide and rule policies, subtly or overtly, had often exacerbated religious differences over decades to maintain control. It's like pouring gasoline on a smoldering fire and then acting surprised when it explodes. The British government, under Prime Minister Clement Attlee, makes the crucial decision to grant independence quickly, aiming to avoid a prolonged civil war. Lord Mountbatten is sent as the last viceroy, tasked with overseeing the transfer of power. You observe him arriving with a mandate to achieve independence within a tight deadline, a timeline many historians still argue was far too short for such a complex, enormous undertaking. The decision is made: partition. India will be divided into two independent states, a predominantly Hindu India and a predominantly Muslim Pakistan, comprising two wings, east and west, separated by over 1,000 miles of Indian territory. Imagine the arbitrary lines being drawn on maps by a British lawyer, Sir Cyril Radcliffe, who had never set foot in India before. These lines, slicing through villages, farms, and even homes, pay little heed to established communities, economic realities, or natural boundaries. It's a decision with catastrophic human consequences. You then witness the horrifying reality of this partition unfolding. As the date of independence, August 15, 1947, approaches, widespread communal violence erupts. Hindus and Sikhs, living in what would become Pakistan, flee to India, and Muslims living in what would become India flee to Pakistan. Imagine millions of people suddenly rendered refugees in their own land, trudging on foot, carrying what little they can, facing unimaginable dangers along the way. Trains packed with refugees are attacked, massacres occur on both sides, and atrocities become commonplace. The scenes of violence, rape, and displacement are truly horrific, a human tragedy on an unprecedented scale. It's an exodus born of fear and hatred, ignited by political expediency. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions, perish in the violence and hardships of the migration. Families are torn apart, livelihoods destroyed, and deep wounds are inflicted that continue to fester decades later. The sheer scale of the human suffering is almost impossible to comprehend. Historians still argue whether partition was an absolute inevitability given the religious divisions, or if different British policies and a more extended transition period could have mitigated the violence. However, the rapidity of the British withdrawal and the lines drawn undeniably contributed to the immediate catastrophe. The partition also creates lasting geopolitical tensions. You see the immediate birth of the Kashmir conflict, a disputed territory that remains a flashpoint between India and Pakistan to this day, leading to multiple wars and ongoing skirmishes. This legacy of division and animosity continues to shape the strategic landscape of South Asia. For Britain, the partition of India represents the end of its most significant colonial possession and a symbolic closure of its direct imperial ambitions in Asia. While hailed as the granting of independence, it is also a moment marred by immense tragedy, a stark reminder that the process of decolonization could be messy, violent, and far from the smooth handover of power that might have been envisioned. The jewel in the crown was indeed handed over, but not before it was shattered into agonizing pieces, leaving a profound and enduring legacy of division and pain. As the dust settled on the tragic partition of India, you now turn your attention to a moment that, more than any other, symbolized the dramatic decline of British global power, the Suez Crisis of 1956. This event, a mere 9 years after India's independence, isn't just a political misstep. It's a humiliating public spectacle that unequivocally marks the end of an imperial era and Britain's aspirations to act as a sole superpower. Imagine Britain still clinging to the idea of its global significance, still believing it could unilaterally dictate terms in regions it once dominated. The Suez Canal, connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, is not just a waterway. It's a vital artery of empire, a shortcut to the oil fields of the Middle East and the remaining Commonwealth nations in Asia and Australia. Though nominally owned by an international company, Britain and France held significant shares and saw it as vital to their strategic interests. You witness the key moment. In July 1956, Gamal Abdel Nasser, the charismatic and fiercely nationalist president of Egypt, announces the nationalization of the Suez Canal Company. He declares that Egypt will take full control of the canal, using its revenues to fund the ambitious Aswan Dam project. Imagine the outrage in London and Paris. For Britain, this isn't just about money. It's about control, prestige, and the perceived humiliation of a former colonial subject defying its will. It's like a beloved antique watch that you still proudly display, suddenly announcing it's going to work for someone else. The British Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, views Nasser as another Hitler, a dangerous dictator who must be stopped. You see Britain, in a desperate attempt to reassert its fading influence, secretly conspiring with France and Israel. The plan is audacious and deceitful. Israel would attack Egypt, providing a pretext for Britain and France to intervene, supposedly to protect the canal and restore order, but truly to depose Nasser and regain control. You then observe the unfolding of this ill-fated plan. In late October 1956, Israeli forces invade the Sinai Peninsula. Immediately, Britain and France issue an ultimatum to both sides to cease fire and withdraw. Knowing full well Egypt would refuse, then Anglo-French forces launch an airborne invasion and naval bombardment, ostensibly to protect the canal. However, world reaction is swift and overwhelmingly negative. You see, the United States, under President Dwight D. Eisenhower, furious at being kept in the dark and deeply concerned about alienating Arab nations and pushing them towards the Soviet Union in the midst of the Cold War. The U.S. publicly condemns the invasion, threatening severe economic sanctions, including a crippling run on the British pound. The Soviet Union also condemns the action, even threatening to intervene militarily. For a moment, it feels like the whole world is holding its breath, teetering on the brink of a larger conflict. Imagine the shock and humiliation in London. Britain, accustomed to acting as a world power, is suddenly reined in by its closest ally, the United States. You see Eden, utterly defeated, forced to order a humiliating ceasefire and withdrawal. The military operation, though successful on the ground, is a complete political disaster. It's the ultimate reality check for a fading empire, like tripping spectacularly on a red carpet while trying to make a grand entrance. Historians still argue whether the Suez Crisis was a necessary evil to check Nasser's ambitions or a self-inflicted wound that accelerated Britain's decline. But what is undeniable is its profound symbolic impact. It demonstrates unequivocally that Britain can no longer act unilaterally on the global stage without the approval of the emerging superpowers, particularly the United States. It exposes the fragility of its remaining imperial power and its diminished influence. For the British public, it's a moment of profound introspection, a stark realization that the days of imperial grandeur are truly over. You witness a shift in national identity, a reluctant acceptance that Britain is no longer the dominant global force, but rather a middle-ranking power. The Suez Crisis is the final, definitive nail in the coffin of the old empire, forcing Britain to fundamentally redefine its role in a rapidly changing world. The empire isn't just shrinking, it's being publicly dismantled, with the painful lessons of the Suez Crisis etched into the national consciousness. You now observe a fascinating transformation, the evolution of the British Empire into the Commonwealth. This isn't just a rebranding, it's a deliberate, yet often pragmatic, attempt to maintain a relationship with former colonies, shifting from coercive rule to a voluntary association of independent nations. Imagine the sheer audacity. After centuries of direct control and often brutal exploitation, Britain proposes a partnership based on equality and shared values. It sounds almost too good to be true, and in many ways, it was a practical necessity. With the empire dissolving at an unprecedented pace, Britain needed a way to preserve some influence, maintain trade links, and perhaps salve its conscience. The Commonwealth becomes that bridge, a clever invention to manage the aftermath of empire. You see the origins of this idea even before full decolonization. Countries like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, as self-governing dominions within the empire, had already developed a degree of autonomy by the early 20th century. The Statute of Westminster in 1931 formalized their legislative independence, laying the groundwork for a voluntary association. These countries essentially transitioned from being possessions to being independent members of a club, albeit one where Britain was still the founding and most prominent member. After World War II and the wave of decolonization, the Commonwealth truly takes shape. You witness newly independent nations, like India, choosing to remain within this new grouping. This is a crucial development. India, despite its bitter history with British rule, sees value in maintaining ties for trade, diplomatic influence, and historical connection. This decision fundamentally changes the nature of the Commonwealth, transforming it from an exclusive club of white settler nations into a truly multicultural and multiracial organization. It's like a grand old private members club suddenly deciding to open its doors to everyone, regardless of their past relationship with the original members. The core principles of the Commonwealth are based on voluntary cooperation, shared values, and mutual respect. You see member states, now sovereign and independent, cooperating on issues such as trade, education, sport, and democracy. The British monarch remains the head of the Commonwealth, a symbolic role that acts as a unifying figure. Without any political power over member states, it's a bit like being the chairperson of a very large, diverse book club, where everyone reads different books. However, the path isn't always smooth. You observe tensions and disagreements within the Commonwealth, reflecting the diverse interests and experiences of its members. Issues such as apartheid in South Africa, human rights abuses in certain member states, or disputes over trade policies often lead to heated debates and, occasionally, to temporary withdrawals or suspensions from the organization. It's a family reunion where everyone might not always get along, but they're still, well, family. Historians still argue whether the Commonwealth is merely a polite euphemism for a post-colonial hangover or a genuinely valuable institution promoting international cooperation and soft power. What is clear is that it provides a platform for dialogue and collaboration, allowing Britain to maintain links with countries with whom it shares a complex history, without the burden and moral baggage of direct rule. You also see the practical benefits. For many newly independent nations, the Commonwealth offers access to educational resources, technical assistance, and a network of diplomatic support. For Britain, it provides continued access to markets, cultural influence, and a voice on the global stage that might otherwise have diminished even further. Today, the Commonwealth comprises 56 member countries, spanning every continent and encompassing a third of the world's population. It's a testament to the enduring, albeit evolving, relationships forged during the imperial era. You watch as the empire, through a remarkable act of reinvention, transforms itself into a voluntary association, leaving behind the hard power of coercion for the softer power of shared history and mutual, if sometimes complicated, interest. It's a remarkable second act for a global power learning to live in a world where it's no longer the undisputed star. You've just witnessed the remarkable transformation of the British Empire into the Commonwealth, a new, voluntary association. But as you look at the world today, you can't escape the enduring impact of what came before. You are now observing the lingering shadows of the British Empire, the complex and often challenging legacies that continue to shape nations, economies, and societies long after the Union Jack was lowered. Imagine a grand old house that's been renovated many times over, while the new owners have put their stamp on it. The original foundations, the layout of the rooms, and even some of the quirks from previous eras still influence its character. The British Empire is much the same. Its imprint, for better or worse, is indelibly stamped on countless nations. One of the most visible legacies is political and legal systems. You see parliaments modelled on Westminster, legal frameworks based on English common law, and administrative structures that mirror those established by the British Raj. While these systems often brought concepts of rule of law and modern bureaucracy, they were also imposed, sometimes without regard for indigenous traditions, and could be prone to corruption or instability. After independence, historians still argue whether the imposition of these systems ultimately fostered democracy or inadvertently created avenues for post-colonial authoritarianism. Then there are the borders. You recall the arbitrary lines drawn on maps during the scramble for Africa, often carving up ethnic groups or lumping historical rivals together. These artificial boundaries, imposed by colonial powers, became the basis for independent nations. leading to ongoing ethnic conflicts, secessionist movements, and border disputes that plague many African nations to this day. It's like drawing lines on a cake and expecting everyone to just politely eat their slice, even if half of their family ended up on the other side of the frosting. Economically, the impact is profound. You see many former colonies still heavily reliant on exporting raw materials and agricultural products, a legacy of the imperial system that structured their economies to serve British industrial needs. This often left them vulnerable to global market fluctuations and hampered the development of diverse, self-sufficient industries. The infrastructure built by the British, railways, ports, was primarily designed to facilitate the extraction of resources, not necessarily to foster internal economic integration or development for the local populations. Culturally, the legacy is a rich tapestry of adoption and adaptation. You see the widespread use of the English language as a lingua franca, connecting diverse nations and facilitating global communication, a definite practical benefit. But you also recognize the suppression of indigenous languages and traditions, the imposition of Western values, and the sometimes uneasy blend of local and foreign customs that shape modern identities. Cricket, a decidedly British sport, is played with fervent passion across India, Pakistan, and the West Indies, a charming, yet undeniably colonial, export. You also observe the lingering psychological effects. For many, the empire left a legacy of deep-seated resentment, trauma, and a struggle with national identity in the face of colonial narratives that often denigrated their history and culture. For others, particularly in Britain, there's a complex and often unexamined nostalgia for a perceived golden age, a selective memory that often overlooks the brutal realities of imperial rule. It's a conversation that's still very much alive, often heated, and far from settled. The movement of people is another significant shadow. You see large diaspora communities in Britain formed by migration from former colonies seeking economic opportunities or fleeing post-independence instability. This has profoundly reshaped British society, making it more diverse, but also leading to complex social dynamics and ongoing debates about identity, immigration, and multiculturalism. Historians still argue vehemently over the net balance of the empire's legacy. Did it bring modernization, infrastructure, and the rule of law, or did it primarily involve exploitation, violence, and the stunting of indigenous development? There's no easy answer, and the truth is undoubtedly a complex blend of both. The British Empire, though formally dissolved, continues to cast its long, intricate shadow. Its systems, its lines on maps, its economic structures, and its cultural imprints are woven into the fabric of the modern world. Understanding these lingering shadows is not just an academic exercise. It's essential for comprehending contemporary global challenges and the ongoing efforts of nations to forge their own paths in a world shaped by a past they didn't choose. Having explored the enduring global impacts of the British Empire, you now bring your gaze back to the source. Modern Britain. This isn't the mighty imperial power of old, but a nation grappling with its past redefining its place in the world and struggling to reconcile its historical narrative with contemporary realities. The empire may be gone, but its legacy is deeply intertwined with Britain's very identity, sometimes comfortably, often uncomfortably. Imagine Britain today. You see a vibrant, multicultural society, a direct result of decades of immigration from former colonies, particularly since the 1950s. London, a global financial hub, pulsates with a diversity of languages, cuisines, and cultures that would have been unimaginable a century ago. This richness is a powerful, living legacy of empire, a tangible connection to the distant lands once ruled. It's like a historical tapestry, woven with threads from every corner of the former empire, now on display in the heart of the country. However, this multiculturalism also brings its challenges. You observe ongoing debates about national identity. What does it mean to be British in a post-imperial world? How do you acknowledge the benefits and joys of cultural exchange while confronting the uncomfortable truths of exploitation and injustice that underpinned the empire? These are not easy conversations, and they often surface in public discourse. From discussions about historical statues to educational curricula, historians still argue about the extent to which the British public has truly come to terms with the darker aspects of its imperial past, or if a significant portion still clings to a romanticized, sanitized version of history. Economically, Britain is no longer the workshop of the world. You see a nation that has shifted from industrial manufacturing to a service-based economy with finance, technology, and creative industries playing dominant roles, yet the old imperial trade routes still hold some sway, and the Commonwealth often serves as a network for continued economic ties. Though no longer on the same unequal terms, the relationship with the European Union and subsequently Brexit also forced a re-evaluation of Britain's global trading partners, sometimes prompting a nostalgic look towards Commonwealth trade that belies the significant shifts in global economic power. Politically, Britain has transitioned from a global hegemon to a middle-ranking power, with a permanent seat on the UN Security Council and a strong voice in international affairs. Particularly through its diplomatic networks and historical connections, you see Britain actively engaging in international development, often leveraging its historical ties through organizations like the Commonwealth Development Corporation. However, its foreign policy is no longer about direct control, but about influence, alliances, and soft power. You also witness the continued impact of empire in popular culture and collective memory. Films, TV shows, and literature often revisit the imperial past, sometimes critically, sometimes nostalgically. The national narrative grapples with the complexities of acknowledging both the achievements and the atrocities, the benevolent gestures, and the brutal realities. It's a constant process of re-evaluation, often sparked by academic research, social movements, or contemporary events that force a re-examination of historical narratives. The very landscape of Britain bears the marks of empire. Grand museums like the British Museum or the Victoria and Albert Museum House vast collections of artifacts from across the former empire, raising ongoing questions about provenance and repatriation. Statues of imperial figures stand in city squares, often sparking protests and demands for recontextualization or removal. These aren't just inanimate objects. They are focal points for living debates about how history is remembered and who gets to tell the story. Modern Britain is, in essence, a nation in constant dialogue with its imperial past. It is a dialogue that shapes its internal social dynamics, its foreign policy, and its sense of self in a rapidly changing world. The empire's shadow is long, but it is also a dynamic and evolving one, prompting reflection, challenging assumptions, and forcing a continuous reimagining of what it means to be British. As our journey through the vast and intricate story of the British Empire draws to a close, you are left with the profound task of reflecting on its complex and contested legacy. This isn't a neat, easily packaged narrative of good versus evil, but rather a sprawling, contradictory tale of power, progress, exploitation, and profound human cost. Imagine standing on a high vantage point, looking down upon a historical landscape scarred and shaped by centuries of imperial ambition. You see the sheer scale of it, a quarter of the world's landmass, a quarter of its people, once under one flag. This was an empire of unprecedented reach and duration, a global force that connected disparate parts of the world, for better or worse, in ways that had never been seen before. On one hand, you observe undeniable advancements. The empire undeniably brought elements of modernization, railway networks, irrigation systems, telegraph lines, and administrative structures that, in some cases, provided a degree of stability and infrastructure where it had been lacking. You also see the spread of the English language, which became a powerful lingua franca, facilitating global communication and commerce. Concepts of parliamentary democracy and the rule of law, however selectively applied, were introduced in many regions. Historians still argue about the extent to which these introductions genuinely benefited the colonized peoples versus primarily serving the interests of the colonizers. Yet, on the other hand, you cannot ignore the immense human cost. You recall the brutal realities of the transatlantic slave trade, the horrific exploitation of millions whose lives were utterly consumed by the pursuit of profit. You remember the devastating famines in India, exacerbated by British policies that prioritized export over local food security. You consider the violence of conquest and repression from the Indian Rebellion to the Mau Mau uprising, where indigenous populations faced overwhelming force and often unimaginable cruelty. The imposition of arbitrary borders, the disruption of traditional societies, and the suppression of indigenous cultures left deep and lasting scars. It's like looking at a beautifully painted portrait and then realizing the paints were mixed with tears and blood. The empire was built on a foundation of racial hierarchy and a pervasive belief in British superiority. This mindset justified exploitation and often led to dehumanization, creating a system where the lives and rights of colonized peoples were deemed secondary to imperial interests. The economic advantages for Britain were immense, fueling its industrial revolution and making it the wealthiest nation on earth. But this prosperity was often directly extracted from the resources and labor of its colonies. You also see the enduring debates, the lingering questions. Was the empire a force for progress, however flawed, or primarily an instrument of oppression? How do nations reconcile their present identities with this complex past? These aren't just academic questions. They resonate in contemporary political debates, in discussions about reparations, and in the ongoing efforts to decolonize educational curricula and public spaces. The narrative of empire is continuously being re-evaluated, challenged, and rewritten from diverse perspectives. The legacy is not simple, and perhaps that is the most important lesson. It's a tapestry woven with threads of innovation and exploitation, progress and destruction, cultural exchange, and profound loss. It reminds you that history is never static, never fully settled. It is a living thing, continually debated, reinterpreted, and felt in the echoes of the present. So, as the story of this titanic empire fades into the quiet of the night, perhaps you're left with a sense of its immense scale, its profound contradictions, and the indelible mark it left on both the colonizer and the colonized. It is a story of human ambition, resilience, and often tragedy, a chapter in global history that continues to shape the world you wake up to tomorrow.